Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Community Budget Workshop. My name is Greg Hart. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Business Services and Capital Projects for the Clover Park School District. This evening, I will be presenting some budget information for you all to consider in anticipation for developing the 24-25 budget. After I go through these slides, we will then listen to any input those in the room have for us. Next slide. Let's start off by looking at the timeline. We won't go into detail on everything shown here. What we're really trying to illustrate is that the budget development is a year-round process. A lot of the heavy lifting happens during the spring, and the board votes to adopt the budget in the summer. Then we restart the whole process. Next slide. Next, let's review enrollment. Enrollment is the primary driver of our funding. Simply speaking, the more students we have, the more funding we receive. So it's important that we put a lot of effort in projecting future enrollment. This graph shows our enrollment trend over the last 5 years. You'll see in the 1920 school year, we had well over 12,000 students. Then you see the sizable drop the following year. This drop coincides with the pandemic in 2020. We're not alone in seeing this drop in enrollment. This was a statewide and nationwide trend. You'll see over the last few years, the numbers have leveled off. The good news is that our district was conservative in our enrollment projections, which helped us avoid major budget shortfalls. Next slide. Okay, let's look at our revenue. So where does the money come from? We have various sources of revenue. First, there are state revenues. Every year, the state sets funding rates. These rates are applied to our enrollment projections to determine estimated funding. The rates are set during the state's legislative session. The legislature recently wrapped up their current session, and we are in the process of evaluating the impacts to our school district from that legislative session. Next slide. Another type of revenue or funding is federal revenue. This is the type of revenue which is primarily from grants. Most of these grants are based on the district's poverty level. For example, Title I funding, which can be used for intervention services for students. We also receive numerous DoDEA grants from the Department of Defense to support our military population. The federal grants tend to be more restrictive on how we can spend them. They usually come with parameters that we must follow. Another type of funding, federal funding, is impact aid. Many of you are likely familiar with impact aid because every October, the district sends out surveys to families to determine the number of military connected students that we have. The impact aid funding is a direct result of the surveys, which underscores the importance of returning those completed surveys. Next slide. A third major type of funding we have is local funding. This is primarily our local tax collections, otherwise known as our voter approved levy. We run a replacement levy every 4 years. We most recently ran and passed the replacement levy in February of 2024. The levy is a critical portion of our funding that funds various important programs. This includes highly capable programs and interventions for struggling learners, class size maintenance, advanced placement and IB testing, textbooks and library materials, after-school academic programs, security officers and safety support staff, nurses and counselors, student safety, mental health and behavior intervention supports, security enhancements at schools, educational technology, athletics activities, school clubs and programs, and music, art, and performing arts beyond state funding. Next slide. This chart depicts our funding breakdown from last school year. You'll see that the largest piece is our state general purpose funding. This is often referred to as our basic ed funding. We also receive state special purpose funding. This funding must be spent in certain areas. A great example of this would be funding for our special education program. In red, you will see we also receive over $52 million in federal funding. Again, this includes various grants as well as impact aid funding. The other larger piece in green would be our local taxes, which again is our voter approved levy. Next slide. Next, let's review our expenditures. So where does the money go? Schools are funded first. No surprise, that is our top priority. School funding is based on the enrollment of that particular building, as well as any special needs they may have. After schools are funded, the remaining dollars are stretched to meet all other needs, which are really the district support services for our schools. Next slide. Here's the summarized view of how we spent our money last year. First and foremost, most of the costs went towards basic education instruction. We also have a large special education program that spent over $37 million last year. Over $7 million was spent on vocational education. This would be primarily our CTE programs at the middle school and high schools. Next, we have compensatory programs. This category includes many of our federal grants that provide things like interventions and multilingual learning education. Support services are things like busing the kids to and from school, as well as feeding the students. This would also be a lot of the behind the scenes operations of the district. The other support category includes things like early learning programs and COVID response costs. Next slide. So let's talk briefly about our mandatory requirements. These are things that we really don't have much of a choice on how we spend the money. For example, for equity purposes, enrollment is going to determine the amount of basic staff a building gets. If you have this many first graders, you'll have this many first grade teachers, and so forth. We also have various employee groups, each with their own contracts that are collectively bargained. We are required by law to adhere to the requirements of these employee contracts. Then there are special education requirements. Special education students each have their own IEP or individualized education program. We must direct dollars to fulfill the requirements of each IEP. Then there are the operations of the district. Listed are a few examples. We're required to get the students to and from school. We are required to feed the students. We must maintain our facilities to keep a safe and clean learning environment. And of course, health, safety, and security are things we cannot ignore. Next slide. Now we're going to look at a few examples of funding priorities that we want the community to consider as we build our budget. These examples include safety and security, extracurricular, after-school activities, technology, mental health services, family and community partnerships, staff recruitment, athletics, and professional development. Next slide. Here's the schedule for the development of next year's budget. A few highlights. Tomorrow, March 20th, we'll be launching a thought exchange survey to the community to gain more insight into priorities to support student learning. A lot of the budgeting work at schools will occur in April. We'll also hold numerous budget workshops with the school board so they can make an informed decision when it comes time to vote on the adoption of the budget in July. Also in May, we will have a follow-up community budget workshop to provide updated information from this session and as well as the survey results. Next slide. So next, for those in the room, we're going to do some table conversations. We'll bring up a slide. So at your tables, please discuss the following questions. What are your priorities to support student learning? And what additional information do you need or would you like us to know?
So if you two want, you can join together and have a table conversation. So would you want to come over? Do you want? Sure, that would be great. That we could discuss your thoughts and then someone be ascribed. Okay. So that you can share your priorities on supporting student learning, and then if you have additional questions, thoughts, wonders, write those down. Because we'll be following up with you and hopefully you shared your email address. You want to give you things to